Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we begin our language chapter. Now, language, as well as religion, which is our next chapter, are both considered menefacts, components of the ideological subsystem of culture. And while language and religion are these really enduring pieces of culture, the reality is they're constantly changing. For example, new artifacts and new sociofacts are constantly coming into existence and demand new words like retweet and cyberbullying, both of which entered the Oxford English Dictionary in 2011. So let's start out with, what is language? Language is a system of communication through the use of speech, a collection of sounds understood by a group of people to have the same meaning. Now, some definitions will include sounds as well as gestures, marks, signs, or really any kind of symbolic communication. But the reality is that language must include speech, but it can include other things like writing. And we often say that languages that have both components are languages with a literary tradition. It really just means that it's written as well as spoken. Now, 10,000 years ago, the human race consisted of only 1 million people, but spoke an estimated 15,000 languages. Today, a population that is 6,000 times larger speaks 40% as many languages. So how many languages are there then? The most common number that I see is about 7,000, but numbers vary a lot depending on who you talk to. On the low end, the estimate is around 3,000 languages. But most linguistic geographers will acknowledge that the number is somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 languages in existence today. And languages can reveal a lot about the way that people and cultures view reality. For example, some African languages have no word or term for the concept of a god. Some Southeast Asian languages have no tenses, reflecting less of a distinction between then and now. Language also serves as a culture complex for a group of people. For example, Arabic has 80 words related to camel. Japanese has more than 20 words for various types of rice. Russian is rich in terms for ice and snow. Native Hawaiian has reportedly 108 words for sweet potato, 65 for fishing net, and 47 for banana. In the mountainous region of Spain, Spanish has developed a number of words to describe features of mountains or hills. And that's what you see right here. Now, in different groups, like the Caribs of the Caribbean and the Zulus of Southern Africa, there are words that only men or only women are allowed to say. Now, standard language is a language that is substantially uniform with respect to spelling, grammar, pronunciation, and vocabulary, and represents the approved community norm of the tongue. But standard language can be a little bit more complicated in real life because not everyone in a country speaks the language the same way. For example, standard French is based on the dialect of the Paris region. In Spain, Castilian Spanish became the standard in 1492 with the Castile-led Reconquista of Spain from the Moors. Modern Standard Chinese is based on the Mandarin dialect of Beijing. The classical or literary Arabic of the Quran became the established norm of Arabic today. So how is standard language different from official language? Official language is the governmentally designated language of instruction, of government, of the courts, and other official public and private communication. Standard language is going to be the language of day-to-day life, while official language is going to be the language of the government. For example, Zimbabwe, which is home to several large ethnic groups, has the most official languages in the world, 16. That includes English as well as sign language. South Africa, which has a complex colonial and post-colonial history, has a constitution that mandates 11 official languages. And we can also change the scale with regards to official language. For example, the European Union, which is a supranational organization, recognizes 24 official languages while having 3 languages that most of the work is done in. And the United Nations has 6 official languages. Those are Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian, and Spanish. Now, the United States as a country does not have an official language, largely due to our immigrant history of the United States, while also acknowledging the fact that between 10 and 15% of Americans today speak a language other than English. But going to the subnational scale, 31 US states have declared English to be the official language of their state. So let's take a look at the numbers. The largest first language in the world is Chinese, and more specifically, Mandarin Chinese. Now, first language can be synonymous with native language or perhaps standard language. Now, official language, the largest official language in the world is English. And that's because hundreds of millions of people speak English not as their first language, but as a second or third language. And this is a huge example of the impact of colonialism, of trade. We're going to talk more about that later. Now, this slide is an absolute must know. You need to know these terms and their order. And I would add examples of each level, just like the one that you're going to see here for English. Now, the visual that I like to use for this particular classification system is an hourglass. So please draw that in your notes. The language family is the biggest, includes the most languages. For example, the Indo-European language family includes between 400 and 500 languages. Then you have branches. A branch will have fewer languages within it. A language group will have even less, until you get to a single language, like English. That's the pinch point of the hourglass. But within English, you might have multiple dialects, subdialects, and accents. So now let's take a look at each layer of this. A language family is a collection of languages thought to have descended from a single common ancestral tongue long before recorded history. The key here is that there is a shared but very distant origin or ancestor. Now, that common ancestor is known as a proto-language. Now, how many language families are there? Maybe about 100, but numbers differ. On the high end, some numbers say 120, but some linguistic geographers say the more ambiguous phrase, many dozens of language families. The lowest number I've seen is about 30. Regardless, Indo-European is the biggest language family in the world, with nearly half of the world's people speaking an Indo-European language. The classification system is often depicted as a tree. The language family is the trunk. Language branches are, you guessed it, branches. Then groups or smaller offshoots, and the individual languages are represented here as leaves. In our textbook, the size of each leaf represents the number of speakers of each language. The bigger the leaf, the more speakers for that particular language. Now, after families, many of the textbooks and the course articulation differ about the classification system. Our textbook identifies branches and then groups. So we're going to go with that. A language branch is a collection of languages related through a common ancestor, the language family, that existed several thousand years ago. Differences are not as extensive or as old as with the language family, and archaeological evidence can confirm that languages derived from the same family. Within Indo-European, there are commonly 8 identified branches. Those are Germanic, Romance or Italic, Balto-Slavic or just Slavic, Indo-Iranian which are occasionally subdivided into separate branches, as you can see in this image: Armenian, Albanian, Celtic, and Greek, sometimes called Hellenic. Other textbooks identify the second layer of classification as subfamilies. A third and very uncommon way of classifying them are as genetic nodes. I don't think you're going to see it that way. Again, the likelihood that you see the term language group is not quite as high as with language family, but we need to know the proper order just in case they ask. So a language group is a collection of languages within a branch that share a common origin in the relatively recent past and display relatively few differences in grammar and vocabulary. Now we have to clarify, relatively recent past doesn't mean like last Thursday. We're talking perhaps still hundreds of years, all right? But continuing our example for English, English is found in the Indo-European family, the Germanic branch, and the West Germanic group. We could actually even subdivide this further because English is part of the Low Germanic subgroup, along with languages like Dutch, while German, which is part of the West Germanic group as well, is part of the High Germanic subgroup. All right, we've reached the pinch point of the hourglass and now have started to expand into additional differences within a language. So let's talk about dialect. Dialect is a local or regional characteristic of a language, while accent is going to refer to the pronunciation differences of a standard language. A dialect, in addition to pronunciation variation, has distinctive grammar and vocabulary. The three key characteristics of dialect, in order, are vocabulary, spelling, pronunciation. Please write those down. Vocabulary, spelling, pronunciation. And while variations in vocabulary, as well as their meanings, spelling, pronunciation define dialects, it can also include differences in syntax, which is the way that words are put together, cadence, which is the rhythm of speech, and even just the speed or pace of the speech. These variations are significant enough that most speakers will notice them, but small enough that speakers can still mutually comprehend one another. Now this allows us to define accent. Accent is the distinctive manner of oral expression. Accent is basically just pronunciation, which is why pronunciation is the least important element of dialect. Vocabulary and spelling come before that. Okay? It is important to understand this because even if the written form of a statement adheres to a standard language, the accent can reveal the regional home of a person who reads that statement aloud. Now, even within dialects, there are subdialects. For example, English that is spoken in Australia, Scotland, and Mississippi are distinctly different dialects. But even within the United States, there are differences between someone from the South, the Northeast, and the West Coast. So please know these three major dialects of the United States. They are the Northern, which is blue, the Midland, which on this map is green, and the Southern dialect on here, which is red. Now, the Northern dialect diffused through the Erie Canal and along the Great Lakes region. The Midland dialect left from Pennsylvania and traveled down the Ohio River. And there is an upland Southern, which is often called, as you can see it on this map, Hill Southern. That dialect moved through the mountain gaps into Kentucky and Tennessee. The coastal Southern dialect didn't really diffuse very far. Now, if you notice, the Midland dialect, which was really restricted along the East Coast, became the basic form for much of the interior and west of the United States. Now, an isogloss is a boundary that separates regions in which different language usages predominate. And on the last two maps, you could see very clear lines that define different dialects of the United States. Now, on a map, an isogloss will mark the limit of a particular word or usage or dialect, whatever it might be. In reality, the boundary is rarely a simple line. For example, in the West, the dialectical subregions are far less clear, whereas on the East Coast and the Eastern Interior, it was quite clear. Now, vernacular is a characteristic language of a particular group, also known and more commonly known as slang, or jargon or colloquial speech. Essentially, it is a language that is adopted by a social group. Now, later on in class, I'm going to have you guys teach me some high school student slang. So I want you to start thinking of what are some things that high school students in Henderson, Nevada are saying right now. And then we have a little example here that comes from Norway. And Norway and Norwegians use the word Texas to mean crazy. And that's a little bit of slang. Now this graphic depicts the complicated nature of languages. Now it uses a couple terms that I want to clarify. Mutual intelligibility means that two people can understand each other when speaking. So, for example, Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish speakers will be able to understand what one another is saying despite being classified as different languages. They have a different history, which leads to the divergence into different languages, but are mutually intelligible. Now, what does it mean when there's a common history for language, but they're not mutually intelligible? The example I want to use on here is Chinese language. And Chinese language derives from the written form. More on that in a couple of minutes. But the spoken form is not mutually intelligible. So, of the nearly 14 to 1,500 different dialects of Chinese, they are all read the same and use the same written characters, but speak different languages, which are actually considered dialects of Chinese. So let's talk about written language. The origins of modern writing are only about 6,000 years old, and many languages today still do not have a literary tradition, which can make it very difficult to track its diffusion and, perhaps, make them more susceptible to language extinction. Now, perhaps the first evidence of writing can be traced to ancient Mesopotamia and was called cuneiform. Now, cuneiform writing is a form of pictographic written language, which falls into the first of our two broad schools of writing, which is logograms. Now, later groups, like the Babylonians and the Akkadians, which adopted cuneiform characters, made them actually represent syllables in their language, which falls into our other school, phonetics. So we can see that language, even written language, changes a lot over time. So let's take a look at these more closely. All right. Now, logograms are where characters represent entire words. And some of the other early forms of writing that came out of early civilizational hearths like Egypt and China were logograms, just like cuneiform. Now, pictograms, which are basically simple pictures that represent words or concepts or ideas, the best example of that would be Egyptian hieroglyphics. And then the other part of logograms, the part that we still see largely today, are ideograms, which we can define as a system of writing that is used in China and other East Asian countries, in which each symbol represents an idea or a concept rather than a specific sound, as is the case with letters in English. Now, to really illustrate this, if you were to watch television in China, you would probably see news reports and other programs that are subtitled by Chinese characters, so that the speakers of the many different dialects can read and understand what is being said. Now, Chinese is the only major language that is still in this category, though written languages that are based on Chinese, like Japanese, might be included with this. Unless, of course, we are talking about emojis, which, of course, are an excellent way to communicate with one another. Shifting to the other broad school of writing, we have phonetics. And we have two categories within that. We have syllabary, also known as syllabic, where characters will represent blocks of word sounds. This is prevalent throughout the Middle East and Southeast Asia and includes languages like Arabic, Hebrew, Hindi, and Thai. Cherokee is also an example of this. Now, Japanese written language, which I mentioned on the last slide, is a little more complicated because there are 3 different types of written language. Kanji is an ideographic language, as I mentioned on the last slide, and is actually derived from Chinese written language. Characters represent ideas, so for example, it may require knowledge of between 1,800 and 4,000 characters to read a novel in kanji. But there's also hiragana and katakana, which are both syllabaries, each with 46 characters representing blocks of sound. Now, alphabets, which typically have the fewest characters, are where a symbol will represent a sound that can be combined with a bunch of other characters and sounds to form a huge variety of words. The English alphabet, with its 26 characters, is a good example of this and is based on the Roman or Latin alphabet. So we can actually take a look at the evolution of this. The modern English alphabet originated with the alphabet of the Phoenicians, who lived in the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea in what is now mostly Lebanon, and they were really well known for trading around the Mediterranean area. The Greeks then adopted the Phoenician alphabet and modified it a bit. In turn, the Greek alphabet was adopted and modified by the Etruscans. And then later, the Romans, who spread it throughout their empire. And still to this day, the Roman or Latin alphabet forms the foundation for English and a variety of other languages in the Indo-European language family. Now, let's have some fun with this. We're going to take a look at some exit signs from around the world, but we're going to practice before we do that. This is a sign that was, the picture was taken outside the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, France. So I want you to tell me, what languages do you see here? Because I see English and French, okay? Silence, or silence, it's both English and French, spelled the exact same way, different language and different words. Okay? Silencio, that is both Spanish and Portuguese, but one has an accent, one doesn't. Silenzio, that is Italian. Okay? The one that you see in the bottom left there, that is Russian. But it's very similar to Ukrainian. There's mutual intelligibility with those letters because that is the Cyrillic alphabet. Make that note, the Cyrillic alphabet. All right? And then the characters that you see in the bottom right are Chinese characters, but very similar to Japanese characters and would be able to be read. And because the Notre Dame Cathedral is such a prominent tourist attraction, they wanted to make sure that everyone knew that when Mass was in session, had to be silent. You could still take pictures, but you had to be silent. So, we're going to do a fizz. I'm going to show you a series of exit signs, and I want you to tell me what language do we see, and also perhaps the country, the city, or really anything else that you might be able to discern from these pictures. So a little bit of practice with the cultural landscape as well. Bring your predictions to class, and we'll see how you did. Here we go. Our first one. What language do you see, and can you discern anything else from this picture? City, country, anything like that. Our next one. Next, there's a lot of information here. Can you figure out perhaps where in the world this is? Our next one. A little bit different. This one's not the Roman alphabet anymore. Another example. Again, this is that Cyrillic alphabet, so we might be able to narrow it down. Are there any other features in this image that might attract your attention and tell you where in the world it is from? Our next one. Now again, these are all exit signs, but in a lot of these, there's other features that you can look at to help us figure this out. Our next. Obviously, exit, that's in English. We're looking at the characters. This is a good one with regards to syntax, okay, because this one actually reads exit way to if we were to convert it to English. So this is the way to the exit, but exit is the first part of that, and then way to would come after. What language is this, do you think? Let's give a prediction. All right, another one, similar perhaps to another one that we've looked at. Use what you know. And our last one. Make a guess. Where is it from? What language do you see? Bring those predictions to class. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and I will see you in class.